Good morning. Trying again here with everyone in the room. Welcome to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Mara Redman. I'm the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor here at the Miller Center, where I direct the Ripples of Hope project. And that project is aimed at identifying practical approaches to help democratic leaders resolve key challenges. Among those challenges are exactly the one we're discussing today, which is how to make digital architecture safer and more secure. So today's discussion, for me at least, is right on point, and certainly something we as a country are facing in a very serious way as we head into a very consequential November election for our next president. This event is the third in the Miller Center's Election 2024 series of programs, co-sponsored with UVA's Karsh Institute of Democracy, led by Melody Barnes, who you may see around the building here today because she's staying with us for the day. Today here we turn to concerns regarding foreign interference on U.S. elections, and our panel will consider what voters should expect as we approach the final weeks of the 2024 presidential election cycle and what the U.S. can do to combat these actions and maximize election integrity. And I want to emphasize on that point, we will talk about what we can do over this very constrained period of time. We're now under 50 days heading into the election, but also I would like us to talk about what we can and should be doing as a country so that we're not always in this crisis point in election periods. I'm going to be brief with introductions here in the interest of discussion time with our amazing panelists, but so excited to have each of them here with us. Two, Danielle and David, who I'll introduce soon, are in person, and Michael Vatis is on the screen with you. Danielle Citron is a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow, a Distinguished Professor in Law at the University of Virginia School of Law, and Vice President of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. David Salvo is a Senior Fellow and Managing Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy, big task, big challenge, at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And David is an expert in Russian affairs and previously served as a Foreign Service Officer in the U.S. Department of State, with a focus particularly on Europe, Eurasia, and international security issues, in addition to his Russia expertise. And joining us online is Michael Vatis, a law partner at Benesch. Michael will correct my pronunciation of his firm, for which I apologize. Michael's an experienced appellate litigator who advises clients on compliance with U.S. and international privacy and data security laws and regulations. Earlier in his career, Michael was the founding head of the FBI's Computer Crime and Infrastructure Protection Program and an Associate Deputy Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. And he also served as special counsel in the Office of the General Counsel at the Department of Defense. Full disclosure, I knew and worked with Michael at that time as well, so he has an interesting trajectory in being able to describe to us where we were at that time as a country and how much we could anticipate where we are today. Thank you all for joining us. Those of you here in person, we really appreciate your being here, and those of you online as well. I'm going to get this conversation going, but we will also have time for Q&A with the audience, in person and virtual. So for those of you with us in person, please use the index cards that I believe are on folks' seats, and submit your questions in the back. Yes, okay, folks in the back will take those questions. And for those online, please use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to start with a couple with lead-off questions for each of our panelists. I want to say at the front end, any of them could answer any of these questions, and I have also encouraged them to follow up with one another as well. We had the starts of a very rich conversation in the green room before we came in here. We had to cut ourselves off to get mic'd up and come in. So I'm confident that conversation will continue, and I look forward to all of you joining us in the conversation as well. David, can you start us off here, lay the groundwork, given your experience with Russia, your knowledge of Russia and how it operates? Describe the nature of Russia's threat, what their interests are, how it tracks with Soviet era, frameworks for information operations, which we were chatting about a little bit in there, and then maybe, if you can, what other state and non-state actors we should be concerned about as well.
Sure, thanks very much, Mara. And I could spend a whole hour talking about Russian tactics and aims, but let me try to distill their objectives down to two things. The first is often ignored when we talk about it in the United States, and that is there are specific Russian domestic political reasons why they try to interfere in and destabilize democracies beyond their borders, especially in the United States. The Vladimir Putin regime is a autocratic, kleptocratic government. It needs to be able to sell to its people its vision for holding onto power. Having an external other that is in chaos, that is a democracy in disarray, especially in the United States, is extremely important to domestic propaganda outlets in Russia that on a daily basis message and show images and videos and reports of the United States in purported disarray. That is very important for the Kremlin to hold on to power. Then, of course, there are the more obvious geopolitical foreign policy reasons why it's important that the United States be consumed, and not just the United States, but our European allies as well, be consumed with domestic political turmoil. If we are distracted by our global commitments, if there is a administration that is less interested in our global commitments, that plays to Russia's advantage in its near abroad, which is its paramount interest, Ukraine in particular being the most existential and serious case of that, but also in areas like the Middle East, increasingly in Latin America, in our own backyard. So these are sort of the geopolitical flashpoints that make it very enticing for Russia to use low risk, potentially high reward, plausibly deniable in some cases tactics to try to amplify discord in our democracy or outright interfere, as we saw in 2016, in our electoral processes. So those are sort of the overarching reasons. We're going to get into the tactics, but this harkens back to Soviet times. The tactics of information operations, this is part and parcel of Russian military doctrine. You could read their military doctrine, and it will talk about the importance of these sort of hybrid tactics. It will also say that the United States and the West are Russia's overarching adversaries. So there's every reason. This isn't an invention of certain political parties or actors in the United States. This is overt Russian doctrine. There are reasons why they're doing these activities to us, and not just around election season, but every day. And I know we will get into that. Yeah.
Thanks, David. I should just add that we were talking a little bit before. It's also what Russia used in other parts of the world as well, yes, particularly in the context of Ukraine. Most recently, and affecting how other countries might perceive of the United States and NATO in the context of Ukraine. And I'm sure we'll also talk about the other countries. There are other countries and non-state actors as well, but we'll come back to that. Danielle, you've testified before Congress, I think several times, but the one that particularly caught my attention for this discussion was prior to the 2020 elections, where you spoke about the danger of deep fakes and AI, and feel free to explain a little bit of what those terms mean to those folks who may be less familiar. And in that context, you also spoke about the need to amend Section 230. And so can you describe what all of these terms are? Take us out of a very Beltway, translate Beltway language for us on what they are, why they matter, and why you've advocated some changes in things like Section 230 in the context of election interference.
Before I do that, may I just say that first of all, just thank you for having me and with such distinguished guests. And David, when you were saying that the sort of Soviet style disinformation and efforts on surveillance, it brought to mind the ways in which in the, I guess, high-class hotels in the Soviet Union, they always had cameras sort of taping bedrooms and bathrooms, which I guess gets right at the heart of some of what I do, but it made me think of
they still do, by the way.
They still do, right? Yeah.
Someone who's lived there for many years in recent times, yeah.
So anyway,
but
just
it's decades
of a strategy of surveillance And compromise. Okay,
right.
so now to the talking about, what are deep fakes, and the use of video and audio to spread disinformation, and then of course the more dry but I think really exciting law, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and its interplay here. So deep fakes, what I was writing and thinking about with Bobby Chesney in around 2018 was sort of really advanced machine learning techniques that enabled us to create, or technologists then, kind of early creators, video and audio from whole cloth. So capturing people doing and saying things that they never did or said. Now there are of course early forms of that, morphing people's faces into video, more often into porn. And now what we've seen though, it's really democratized. So when I spoke about it in 2019 when Bobby Chesney and I were writing about the sort of national security, democracy, and privacy implications of deepfakery. Now it is so easy. There are tools and apps that anyone can use that takes photos and nudifies people, that can help us create not just, of course, fake porn, but all types of mischief, so that you can manufacture President Biden, President Obama, ways in which we can fake political actors doing and saying things that they never did or said. And so when I testified and am long concerned, every time we have an election, I sort of sit and pray in those there's like a choke point during elections, that if you see someone doing, a very important figure, political figure, doing and saying something that they never did or said in ways that really discredits them, that it can shift the election, that it's people will stay home, people will vote differently, right? And it's in that choke point of now we're voting. And I sort of, my co-author, Bobby Chesney, I will text each other. He's now the dean at UT Law School. We're like, oh my God, here we are again. What we have seen though, of course, is that where we have seen deep fakery kind of explode, and it's been true of 2018 when it first comes and becomes democratized, is really like 95% of deepfakes that we see online are deepfake sex videos. And 99% of those are women's faces morphed into porn. So it's not just celebrities, it's everyday people. And as we've seen, and it relates to what we're talking about today, are people who study disinformation, and in particular, sort of like Soviet-style disinformation and disruption of elections. Nina Jankowicz is someone who was at the forefront of thinking about disinformation. She was in the Biden administration for like 2 seconds before she was discredited as a censor, mobbed online, attacked online, including deepfake sex videos of her that were circulated. So it's an effort to silence. So Section 230, you might say like, of course, but platforms are in the middle. Right, they're the ones circulating, enabling deepfakery, and so surely they're going to do something about it.
And when you say platforms,
so social media companies are an illustration of like at the content layer of the internet. So an internet is like various players, and we might understand as a stack. But at the top layer, where we see content, whether it's Facebook, I don't know if anyone's on Facebook here, but Instagram. Comment sections, like all the ways in which we read and access content on the web, there are parties like companies, tech companies, making billions of dollars on our advertising, collection of our personal information. And there are circulating information. You might think they're going to help us here, right? Because it's their business, their integrity, they're showing us content, whether you're seeing it on your Facebook page, on, I can't say it, X, or I'll say it, Twitter turned X. Wherever you consume social media as well as the news, you would think, well, there's certainly someone here in this environment that can help us stop obvious deepfake sex videos trying to discredit and silence, or the obvious deepfake of a presidential candidate doing and saying something she or he never did or said. Won't they stop that when it begins to go viral? And Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is often why they will not. They are not responsible under a law passed in 1996. And let's note the title, the Communications Decency Act. It was like an effort to get rid of porn on the internet. And that effort kind of fails because porn's everywhere.
And to remind folks, that's the early days of the internet.
Yes, of course. So 25 years ago, this is like so Facebook comes on board in 2005. The iPhone is 2007. You know, social media has not been born, right? So 2 congressmen, now Senator Ron Wyden and a fellow House member, Chris Cox, write a part of the statute that they call Good Samaritan blocking and filtering of offensive content. That's the title, right? And the idea was they were responding to a trial court decision that held AOL responsible or Prodigy responsible for engaging in filtering dirty words. And a court said, if you tried to filter content that was profane, then we're going to treat you as a publisher. So you're strictly responsible. And Congressman Wyden and Cox were worried because they thought, companies will do nothing. They'll sit on their hands if they think trying to address online content that is either illegal or offensive. If they'll sit, we don't want them sitting on their hands. We want to incentivize them to self-regulate. And so Congress, in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, has 2 key provisions. One, it says we're not going to treat an online service provider as a speaker or publisher of somebody else's information, right? In the second part, they say, if in good faith you take down content, we're also not going to we're going to shield you from liability. Now, you might say, okay, those are great 2 provisions. They're going to incentivize taking down and leave. And if you try but you leave up illegality or defamation, you're not going to be punished for it, right? You're not going to be strictly responsible. But Section 230C1 has been so over-broadly understood so that if you leave up deepfakery, defamation, any type of illegality, and worse, if you solicit it, if your business is non-consensual intimate imagery, revenge porn, deepfakery, you're totally not responsible. You say, that's user-generated content, even if you've asked for it, even if you've invited it, even if you profit from it. So when I was brought in to testify before HPSC, the House Intelligence Permanent Select Intelligence Committee, the question was, what do we do about the problems? How am I doing? Am I going on too on?
No, that's
okay. Figured you had to back up for a second to teach you about Section 230.
You're giving Michael time to think about how he's going to explain how we ended up in this place.
Okay, great. I love it. Michael, thank you, bless you. Right, like how we got here. But the question, of course, was like, we have this problem of deepfakery. We see it coming. We know it's a serious thing. We imagine it's going to play an important role and affect our national security and the security of our elections. And if companies aren't doing anything or don't have to, aren't required to do anything, they don't have to internalize the cost they're externalizing, should we do anything about it? And so the question was, and I've advocated for us to reform Section 230 so that they have to earn it, so to speak. And they have to engage in reasonable steps to address intimate privacy violations, cyber stalking, and other things. And we have a bill, I helped Representative Jake Auchincloss draft a bill that's just now out about a way to reform Section 230. But 230 is what is. So we're in this moment, Gesundheit, where online platforms, unfortunately, are increasingly doing nothing to moderate content. That's something David and I were chatting about as we were, caucusing coming in. In the wake of Elon Musk's disassembling all of his content moderation at X, other companies thought to themselves, companies that we all have, everyone here at this have worked with on content moderation, they're not doing it. They haven't lost their advertisers. Gee, content moderation is expensive. We don't have to do it. So we see the kind of firing and disassembling of content moderation in this moment we need so desperately. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Quick finger on that, and the sort of the conflation of companies pulling back at the exact moment when this technology, these AI tools have democratized nefarious activity. Like, this has incentivized other nation states like Iran and China and ordinary citizens to sort of try to tear down the fabric of our democratic society. So it's a real dangerous combination of corporate irresponsibility and the proliferation of these tools.
And
in the case of Twitter/X, it's even worse than that, because you have the owner of X actually participating in the dissemination of disinformation. So he's not just, taking a hands-off attitude. He's actually engaging in the sort of stuff that, I think any objective citizen would want to put an end to, which is disinformation.
Thanks, Michael. And I'm going to turn to you with a question that I've hinted is a challenging one. But I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work of Ann Kokas, who is not here right now, but for folks who haven't read her book, she's a Miller Center affiliate as well as at the School of Media Studies, who happens to be on sabbatical this year. But her book, Trafficking in Data, discusses all of these issues. And so for folks who are interested, I would make a real plug for looking at her work and at that book particularly. Michael, you were, I'm not sure whether it was at Justice, at Defense, or at the FBI during the time period in the kind of immediate aftermath of Section 230, but in the late 1990s. And given your experience at that time, your subsequent work in the private sector, and I should say you've worked in the nonprofit private sector as well as representing clients, what did we know then, or how effectively did we, and by we, the United States government, anticipate what might be coming at us? Was there any sense that the 2016, the 2020, the 2024 elections and the midterms might be profoundly affected by the types of activities that we're seeing?
Certainly not to my knowledge. I think the focus when I was at Justice from 1994 to 1998, there was a lot of attention to trying to encourage the flourishing of internet companies and giving them, a wide berth to engage in activities that a brick and mortar company would not be empowered to do. And I think that Section 230 is a perfect example of that. It allows the Facebooks of the world or the Twitters of the world to not be responsible for things that the New York Times would be responsible for, defamatory content or otherwise illegal or tortious content. I saw it in the development of policy regarding encryption, where there was a debate between law enforcement and the intelligence agencies on the one side, which wanted to restrict or at least allow the government to access encrypted communications to be able to investigate or surveil foreign adversaries or criminal groups. That was on the one side of the debate. The other side of the debate was commercial interests or the government's interest in helping U.S. companies thrive in this whole new space of the internet. When I started getting involved in cybersecurity, the focus was on protecting our what we call critical infrastructures. Critical services like electrical power, banking, oil and gas delivery, communications. Protecting them from disruptive attacks by foreign adversaries or sophisticated non-state actors. And also trying to be able to trace the efforts of the Russians or the Chinese or other sophisticated actors in using the internet as an espionage tool. But I don't recall any discussion whatsoever of the use of the internet and the web. As you said, there were no social media companies, so nobody was even thinking in those terms, but just using the internet and websites as a way of spreading disinformation. I don't recall any attention whatsoever. There were probably some deep thinking, foresighted people at the Defense Department, maybe at the CIA who were thinking about this, but it certainly didn't rise to the policy level, at least to my knowledge.
Thanks. And I want to remind folks, opportunity for questions coming up. So if you're thinking of them, please feel free to put them down. And we've got Alfred Reeves in the back, I think, is going to be helping us in collecting those and somebody mysteriously is going to figure out what happens with the questions online. I'm confident of that. What I'd like us to go back to a little bit is Michael's point, and David, I'm going to look to you, I think, on this. The digital companies were at least a decade, roughly, off from the period of time of the of Section 230 creation. But how were some of our, I'm going to use the word adversaries, sometimes we talk about competitors, but other countries out there, what would you say their degree of foresight was? How much should we have been able to anticipate it? And then also, I want to move us to what can we do about it now? But Russia in particular, you talked about Soviet-era frameworks, Iran, China, and we haven't even gotten to non-state actors.
Sure. I mean, I think the most sophisticated actor, nation-state actor in this space has long been Russia. I mean, China and Iran, in many respects, have copied the Russian playbook in the last 5 to 7 years, but really sort of ramping up even in the last 2 to 3. So when we think about nation-state actors, we're predominantly focused on Russia because information has been at the heart of its foreign policy, its military strategy for so long. I mean, even the most famous example of this from Soviet times even was around the beginning of the AIDS crisis, when a Soviet plant newspaper in India seeded disinformation that a U.S. bio research facility in Maryland, Frederick, Maryland, Fort Detrick, was created essentially the HIV and was the genesis of the AIDS crisis. That then wormed its way through many other witting and unwitting newspaper cutouts, and then ultimately made it onto CBS Evening News with Dan Rather, right? So that was a very low-tech way of having disinformation sort of be part of efforts to tear down sort of the Democrat and exacerbate polarizing issues in democratic society in the United States. Now the technology, as we've just heard, it's lightning fast. The speed is exponential. AI tools make the scale of this activity, almost you can't even imagine it, right? It's unimaginable. So that really is, we think about Russia predominantly. China and Iran have slightly different objectives, I would argue. China is really it's more about trying to promote a positive image of China. So when it wages influence or interference operations, often they're targeting either politicians that they hope will be conduits to promoting policies that are favorable to China, whereas that Russia almost never engages in activity like that because it's hard. It's trying to obviously shape views on things like Ukraine, but it's in the Middle East, but its tactics are different. Iran too is more of a destructive player like Russia, where it's using AI and other sort of social media tools to destabilize and amplify issues that polarize Americans. Yep.
Thanks, that's helpful. Just one follow-up on that point. Can you pull the thread a little bit on what kind of knowledge they have about us to do that, both the United States and Western countries? They kind of know our soft spots. And if you particularly following Middle East issues, you play out some of what you described. Folks should think about what they're seeing in protests around the country, not that there aren't absolutely legitimate reasons to be protesting. But I want you to be thinking about that as David describes how they know us.
I mean, even if we look back at the 2016 Russian interference operation, they were micro-targeting specific slices of the American electorate because they understand in which swing states the election hinges, and they understand really well which issues are sort of most divisive and most sensitive among the American public. So, and they are equal opportunity destructive force. They're not just, say, pro-Trump, even though they clearly have a dog, I think, in the presidential race. They have a meta objective of just trying to wage chaos. So on issues like Black Lives Matter, for example, Russia was setting up pro-Black Lives Matters account all over social media platforms. But they were doing the same with Blue Lives Matter accounts. So they're playing both sides. And the Iranians now are doing this very well on issues like the Israel-Hamas war. And again, Iran has a very clear point of view on this conflict, but they are trying to foment sort of general chaos. So the soft spots are well known, partly because we are an open, transparent society. So our democratic strengths are, in a way, a vulnerability. That doesn't mean we should change our system, but it's just an acknowledgement of a fact. But the Russians study us because they consider us their primary adversary. So they know us extremely well, way better than we know them. Way better than we know, I would argue, even our friends in Europe. And that's partly, I think, a cultural and political phenomenon in the United States.
There happens to be bipartisan.
That's bipartisan, absolutely. We just, even the foreign policy establishment, people who know these issues for their jobs, they don't know them quite as well as our adversaries know us. So yes, our soft spots are well known.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I want to turn us to where some solution sets are.
Can I build on the sort of problem before we get to the solutions? Just to build on your
problems are always a lot easier to deal with.
No. I'm so happy to talk solutions. Like, that's what lawyers are for, right? We hope for reform. But just to build on David, your astute comments of, like, here we are in a time of deep distrust. That is distrust, like trust decay, truth decay, where we think we can't believe anything. Can't trust what our eyes and ears are telling us, is at an all-time high. That is, we think of truth as being like in doubt, period. And we also are at a time of deep distrust in our institutions. So that, China, there's a deep fake that's alleged to be attributed to and of course the US government won't say this, but to China, of the Maui fires. There was a deep fake that seemed to suggest the US government was behind those fires. Right. So, leveraging, kind of taking a playbook, out of the Russian playbook, and
absolutely
being destructive. Not just to say that the idea of distrust in institutions is such an important goal.
It is,
as you were noting, polarization and distrust in our institutions.
And even Russia's main propaganda outlet targeting global audiences, Russia, it's now known as RT, but formerly Russia Today, its motto is question more. It is making very clear the fact that it wants its audiences to question what truth and truth is, what fact is. So this is
and
their
just
MO.
One example, only because I feel like I live it. I think we always can understand things when we understand the human experience. So Nicole Paul-Roth, the New York Times journalist, was writing, I guess, in 2019, so before the 2020 election, about how Russia had engaged in election interference and getting the black vote out. And Russia Today put out a story calling her stupid and ignorant. So this is Russia Today, the question everything outlet, right? Thank you for that. Targeting her integrity, her reporting, calling her a liar. And then, of course, what follows is a cyber mob. So on right-wing outlets and just Twitter, Facebook, are attacks on Nicole Paul-Roth, death and rape threats, doxings or her home address. And her response to all of it was, like so many victims of online abuse, which is there's no way to respond but silence, right? So the idea is to undermine the ability of journalists to speak and criticize these malign foreign influence campaigns, which is like another thing we ought to look out for. But you wanted to ask about solutions, so I'm going to let you ask.
I did, and I want to unpack in doing that, and this is for both you and Michael, and I will get to, I'm actually going to be bringing in the audience questions, because some of them go to the questions I want to ask you, which is the challenges and why has it been so hard to revise Section 230. In that context, I also want to come back to what Michael was talking about, the internal debates and encryption challenges within the USG in the late 1990s, because I think some of the, even within the public sector, differences of views between the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, the Defense Department, and Justice can make it very challenging to work out solution sets. And that's before you bring in various private sector interests as well. And for any legislation to pass, there's always, and you can argue there ought to be, heavy private sector in one way or another, individual citizens and or companies' participation in impacting legislation. But how do all these factors combine on legislative solutions, and both for Michael and for you, Danielle. And are there things we can do short of legislative answers to be able to address? Are there things we think our government is doing that we can talk about in an open forum for this election or going forward?
Michael.
Yeah, Michael, let me throw it to you first.
Yeah, I think, like Danielle, I'm a proponent of amending Section 230, preferably through a statutory amendment, but if the courts need to start interpreting it basically 180 degrees differently from how they've been interpreting it, I think that would go a long way, because what you want is for platforms to be treated as publishers.
Michael, one second. Can we increase volume?
Especially the ones that are encouraging the content. And, we often use the courts and the judicial system as our backstop or fallback method of regulating conduct that Congress or state legislatures just refuse to regulate directly. And so we do it through the tort system, and it's proven to be effective throughout our history. And so if platforms are liable for fake content, defamatory content, they will have an incentive to start policing it more, rather than just saying, we're not getting involved, as Mark Zuckerberg has said this year. I think that would go a long way. The other thing I think we really need to do, and this goes back to something we talked about earlier, the government needs to play a role in identifying fake content when it's put out there by our foreign adversaries. And we saw nascent efforts at that be basically dismantled because of allegations that the government was engaging in censorship of, the way it was put was of right-wing or pro-Trump views, when in fact all they were doing was trying to identify fake content. And there's got to be some way of getting consensus that foreign influence that's not transparent, that you don't know that it's Russia or China or Iran doing it, that's bad for our democracy, regardless of which side it is favoring, and the government needs to be empowered to do something about it. The problem with that is when you have a foreign government that is trying to help one party in an election, that party tends to want to allow the foreign interference. I mean, we saw that with the Trump campaign in 2016. Whatever your views are about, whether there was collusion or a conspiracy, it is certainly the case, and the Mueller report found this, that the Trump campaign welcomed the assistance of the Russian information operations. And, I am sure that the same can be said of this year when we start learning more and more about Russian influence. And sometimes, it's not just the Republicans that, accept foreign influence. If you go back as far as the election in 1940, FDR, I think it's well established now, knew about British influence operations in Washington, D.C. and to influence the 1940 re-election campaign of Roosevelt, because, they had a common interest, which was getting the U.S. involved on the side of Great Britain and France in World War II. And that's, I think, a fundamental problem of, if one party is being favored, that party is going to tend not to want to do anything about the foreign influence that's helping them.
Thanks, Matt, Michael. Danielle?
So you would like me to tackle the disagreement around reform or solutions that might attract some agreement? Or?
I would say a little bit of both.
Yeah.
So in other words,
course.
Since you've been working and trying to move forward solutions on 230,
Yep.
How much does that tell us about where who the stakeholders are and how you can get the number that I always think of in Senate terms, how do you get to 60?
Right.
How do you get to the numbers that will allow you to have sustainable legislation on this?
Right. I mean, just to note that the tech lobby, NetChoice, and others is just profoundly powerful, right? Not only on the Hill, but of course in state lawmakers. Like the privacy laws that we have on the books right now at the state level are basically written by Amazon and NetChoice, so they're really weak sauce. Let us not, think anything other than that. So it's a little depressing as an advocate and someone who works with lawmakers, to see that. Some of the dissonance here is that on the one hand, you've got a set of actors, and I would say many of them Republicans, who say that Section 230's problem is that we should tear it down because otherwise companies will censor me and my speech. Now, that's not true. I mean, companies are enforcing their hate speech rules and taking down speech. It's not really a censorship of a political party, but that's the argument. And on the other hand, folks that I work with both Republicans and Democrats, so it's not as if, but they disagree fundamentally on what the problem is, right? Republicans think 230 should go because otherwise companies will filter my speech, right? Whereas on the other hand, Democrats think the problem is they're filtering too little. They're leaving up, material that involves foreign influence, child, sex abuse material, non-consensual intimate imagery. They're leaving up all sorts of illegality and mischief. So then the question is how do you get them to come together? Some of those efforts have been, anytime you say the word kids, people will come together and talk to you. So I did some work on Section 230 reform that it's just too narrow, right? It doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
But does it give you a hook into?
It gives you a hook into getting, like Blumenthal and Graham, for example, and working on legislation that we did around Section 230 on the Earn It Act.
Describe that a little bit. When you say it's too narrow, but just so people understand where the common ground is. That you can
too narrow in the sense of notion that with regard to just child material that it deals with children, that we'd have to have a set of procedures around dealing with content addressing youth. It's already illegal under federal law, child sex abuse material, and so that's not exempt from Section 230. That is, child sex abuse material is a federal crime, and federal crimes are not, you're not off the hook for that, like under 230. But what the Earn It Act would do is, like, as to illegality addressing youth, Nazi Sam, other kinds of illegality, the FTC would have to lay out procedures to deal with that. So that's like, okay, we gotta wait for the FTC to lay out procedures? Like, it was the most, I thought, useless, no offense to them. Like, I was happy to help them, but, friends, let's really get to ensuring that these companies have duties of care, is my view. You should have a duty of care. If you're gonna enjoy a legal shield, you should have a specified duty of care. So there are 7 steps that we can lay out, having worked with companies for 15 years. I can tell you the duty of care, what it should look like. I don't need the FTC to lay it out. So I think we can clarify law, should be clear, right? When I was first arguing for steps that would be taking, the duty of care would be taking reasonable steps to address illegality. So when I testified, Congressman then Nunes said, but what's reasonableness? We can't figure out reasonableness. I was like, dude, the law is all about reasonableness. Like, I got you. Let me tell you, tort law, crim pro, like reasonableness is everywhere in the law, right? That's not a good excuse. But I understood the objection to be, it's vague.
Yeah.
Right, so what I've been working on...
Which recalls like the famous Supreme Court case, pornography, I know it when I see it.
Right, exactly. No, that's a great analogy, right? But actually in law, reasonable is not just like a gut. We actually have so much case law about what reasonable steps is in tort law with certain duties of care. But I took the critique, and I think we should, and we can lay out steps that would be reasonable and perform a duty of care. So that if you're gonna get the legal shield, you gotta, in some sense, be doing that duty of care, right? But will we get actors to agree on this? The bill that I worked on has bipartisan support, but it's like 2 lone Congress people, right? So I'm not suggesting
they're pretty far away from 60.
They're way far away from even making it to the Senate side and having 60, right, in the Senate. But I do think, your question about reform and solutions, do I think we can get people from thinking the problem is there's too little content, there's too much content moderation, and then there's too little? That's like a hard thing to bridge. But if you can come forward with a set of problems that we all think are problematic,
Which goes to kids.
which goes to kids, and I've been working on cyber stalking, intimate privacy
Yeah.
violations, and what we call digital forgeries as a form of deepfakes, that if we think that's costing us civil rights and civil liberties in the here and now, then maybe we can get us to think about duties of care. So that's one way forward, is like, it's hard to bridge the divide, but if there are problem sets that we think, both sides think, that's a problem, that's deterring speech, it's silencing people, it's ruining careers, then maybe we can kind of come to an agreement. I don't know what Dave thinks of that idea, but
Well,
it doesn't really get at the problem of foreign
Yeah,
malign influence, right, that could be protected speech.
on that side, I would argue the absence of any sort of regulatory regime does hurt. I mean, if you think about most industries in our country, like if an airline doesn't enforce its existing procedures and it leads to an air crash, there are serious repercussions for that company. If Meta allows a foreign interference campaign that spreads disinformation about how and when and where to vote, targeting American citizens, there are no repercussions for that. There are no repercussions. So a lot of these companies have policies. Reddit and YouTube are good examples that say we will not allow Russian state propaganda outlets. We will not allow links to them on our platforms. But there are all sorts of tactics that allow the circumvention of those policies, and the platforms don't enforce it at all. And then these, proxy links or proxy sites are linked to and show up like in the top 3 Google and Bing search results, and then Americans are just accessing Russian propaganda, not through Reddit and YouTube and Google, not knowing that they're encountering Russian propaganda. And it's like there's a labeling policy that these companies have, and they're not enforcing it. So, in the absence of any sort of stick, these companies are clearly not going to enforce even steps that they say are designed to be proactive and duties of care. So it's a real problem.
Can I say one thing why they're not enforcing it? It's because likes, clicks, and shares are advertising revenue, right? So even if
so the business case for them is a strong
business,
one.
They say that our shareholders demand it. Money on the table is money I need to take off the table. So even if it costs them a little PR, which we've seen some moments of PR that have gotten us some way into these companies, like whether it's Gamergate or the fappening, the spread of celebrities' nude photos, like they'll work with us, right? And then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, we'll make more money by. Like, we won't enforce these rules.
Right.
Right? Okay. Sorry.
Which harkens back to the Mark Zuckerberg quote that
Right.
that
Michael was talking about.
mentioned. Because there's a compelling bottom line to this. What I want to layer in as well in a couple of these questions, and I will get to more of these questions in the time that we have, is that other countries do have different the United States is at the far end of the continuum in terms of weak regulatory structure. I'm curious on your take on the EU has tried to be more aggressive, Japan, some other Asian countries, and then at the far end of the continuum, you have China, which, while they fully exploit for various reasons our lax structure, does not have widespread access at all, very much controls what their citizens can access, and has age limits as well on things like TikTok or TikTok-like apps. So in terms of where we stand vis-a-vis others, but maybe let's take the European example. Are there things we can learn from what they're doing? Their elections have also been significantly challenged by bad actors.
Who wants to start? You want to start? I mean,
I'm talking too much.
Michael, do you have any thoughts on that, or should we go to David?
Go to David. I can come back later.
So the EU, the European Union, does have a regulatory regime that ostensibly is supposed to hold the social media companies' feet to the fire on all the online harms that Danielle's laid out, but also on foreign interference and influence campaigns. I would say the intent is noble. The actual implementation of it is fairly spotty. And it also hasn't precluded Russia, but also China and Iran and other actors to still use the social media platforms as conduits to spread disinformation, misinformation, state propaganda, because there are all these loopholes that the platforms don't enforce, and because the platforms, I believe, the social media companies, have made an assessment that whatever monetary fines the European Union is going to levy on them, they're happy to just pay.
Totally.
Which goes to the business case.
It goes to the business case.
Absolutely.
So, and then I'm not sure that that type of regulatory regime actually, I'm not an advocate of banning Russian state propaganda outright. I just want it labeled so that consumers understand exactly, if you want to go and consume Russia Today, by all means, you should have that right. But you should be very aware of what you're consuming. You're consuming propaganda that was created in the Kremlin.
Actually, and Michael, no, I'm going to turn to you. I just want to layer into that a question that we have in the audience on what are the prospects for mandating that platforms incorporate digital watermarking to alert end users. In this case, the questioner was asking alert end users to the presence of AI-generated content. But to your point, it could alert to any content that is of question.
It's certainly possible, right? Bobby Chen and I considered it in our work. And it's something that technologists like Hani Farid think we may have some interventions around authenticity. The problem is, I think, encoding into law a technological solution that might get easily outmoded. It's sort of like we do, you don't want to say the problem is fixed, here we go, and then you have some technological response embedded in law that's useless. So I guess I have never sort of forwarded the idea that I thought Congress should say, you've got to label things. We also have a compelled speech problem around the First Amendment. Some of what makes it difficult for us is that we do have a First Amendment. And the EU's approach
which we believe in.
Which we do. I'm a big fan. People may think I'm the enemy. I'm not the enemy of free speech. I just want to enable speech from not being silenced, right? But, the sum of what, Europe's sort of notice and take down approach is valuable, but the virality of this stuff often doesn't catch up with it. And then some of their approach to digital harms, they have a stronger coercive arm because they don't have a First Amendment, but I wish they used it more, right? The joke about the fines is that, of course, Meta and X, they have fines that, Grindr was an atrocious violator of intimate privacy. And the only DPA, the Data Protection Agency to go after Grindr was Norway. And the fine was 10 million euros, which is not nothing, but where's the rest of Europe? And the fines, Facebook had a fine vis-a-vis the FTC for violating a consent decree. And it was what was it, $5 billion? And Facebook was writing the check, woohoo, we're good. That was literally 5 seconds of advertising revenue for a day. So, right, that's truly, they write that check, and the Europeans, unfortunately, are less aggressive in enforcement. They don't have great privacy laws either. They're slightly better than ours. We have a Digital Harms and Digital Safety Act coming in the UK. But if you don't have enforcement, then what's good is it doing at all, right? Yeah. So that's some of the problem.
And how do we get to it? Michael, thoughts on any and all of the above?
Yeah, there's so many policy areas, as I alluded to earlier, where legislatures or regulatory agencies are just not up to the task because they're divided or they're too slow. And so the last recourse is often the courts. And, I think there's a lot more hope of getting courts to reinterpret Section 230 in a way that enables tort suits against platforms on the basis that they've encouraged defamatory or content or misinformation. My law firm represents Smartmatic in the suits against Fox and Newsmax over defamatory content that really destroyed the business of the company. And I think everybody's aware of the similar suit that was brought by Dominion, another election technology company that settled for $750 million by Fox. That's another example of a tool to try to put a price on misinformation. Brazil is another example. Recent news. I think Elon Musk and X have, I think in the last day or 2 days, essentially caved to Brazilian courts ruling that they had to pay fines for not taking down misinformation and for not having a physical representative in the country that, could be punished when the courts decided that X had done something illegal. And I think that's another example of, economic pressure works on companies because, as we've been talking about, ultimately they are guided by the profit motive. And so if you put a dent in their profits, they're going to respond accordingly. And to me, as much as I would like a more direct solution, just don't think we're going to get there anytime soon.
Thanks, Michael. And I'm glad you brought up the Brazil example because it is fascinating. We don't have time to cover it today, but of a very strong Supreme Court. We have a very strong Supreme Court here for a variety of reasons, but the Brazil Supreme Court, not just in the most recent example with X, but in the last elections as well, where they had a very difficult election scenario. And the court was extraordinarily strong in how it dealt with social media and what was allowed and not. So I think it's an intriguing example to look at our courts, not just the Supreme Court, and a broader litigation strategy. I know we're coming on time, but I want to take one last question here from the audience that I'm hoping you guys can give us a hopeful response to. Hint, but I recognize it's a challenge. The question is the United States any better or less prepared for this election, 2024, than we were in 2016 or 2020?
I feel like, David, you know this best, but I can answer too.
From a government perspective, believe it or not, despite all the alarming talk today, I think we are better prepared today than we were even 4 years ago, certainly better prepared than we were in 2016. There are a couple reasons for that. One, we recognize the problem. We know the threat. No one is denying, well, okay, there are people who deny the threat. But even, like, I watched a hearing of the Senate Intelligence Committee a few months ago, and even the most strident pro-Trump senators were saying, yes, we recognize that Russia, China, and Iran are trying to interfere in our elections. So there's agreement there. Government's organized better than we were even 4 years ago. The intelligence community has a dedicated hub that pulls from the entire intelligence community to track these threats. We are focused on it from a policy perspective, trying to raise the costs on nation-state actors that do this. We are trying to create better deterrence against this activity. The federal government and state and local governments are in better coordination to protect our election infrastructure than ever before. And we've learned the hard way. Like in 2016, our voting systems were probed by Russian actors. Votes weren't changed, but we realized that we had vulnerabilities in our infrastructure. There's more resources available for underfunded state and local election officials to address these threats. Election officials who have been on the firing lines, I mean that literally over the last couple years, dealing with the disinformation deluge, they've been getting out ahead of these issues in many cases, including in like really key areas like Maricopa County, Arizona, where they understand, hey, AI and deepfakes, this is going to be the election where this really manifests for the first time. We need to have a strategy to deal with this. It needs to involve the platform companies. It needs to involve the Department of Homeland Security. So there's just more energy, more activity focused on these issues. That gives me encouragement, even if the threat ecosystem is so hard to wrap our heads around. That gives me encouragement going into November.
Thank you.
I think I have something hopeful to add.
Okay, please.
Okay, that I used to think electoral federalism was a bad thing, right? That is, the decentralization and lack of federal uniformity, would allow, kind of all the worst parts of bureaucracies to happen at the local level, and it's hard to expect.
Because every state has its own election laws.
Own laws and counties, and they got different voting machines, and now I think, thank God, because there's no one point of attack. So I think, there, in a way, I am more hopeful for that reason, that it is actually structural for us, right? The commitment to having states and localities run elections. So I think, God bless that. So as I go vote in a few minutes, I think that's a great thing.
Early voting, that's right. Michael, anything to add or ready to close?
Just with regard to what Danielle just said, I agree with her to some extent, but at the same time, the closeness of our elections in recent years means that one state or even one locale within a state can be a single point of failure, because that can turn the election easily. So, focusing on Pennsylvania and influencing 10,000 or 20,000 votes, that could be, election determining in a sense. So, I agree with what David was saying. I think we are in better shape, but I'm still tremendously nervous. I'm just waiting for
Oh, we nervous.
something bad to happen in the next 50 days.
I still pray,
But
don't
hopefully we are on top of it. I know we want to be encouraging. But I think the citizenry has to play a role too. We all need to be willing to call out misinformation when we see it, and talk about it.
Thanks. I think that's a great note to end on, because I want to thank all of you for being here for the discussion. I want you to all consider yourselves, both in this room and online, proselytizers for what folks here have been talking about in terms of calling out misinformation when you see it. We all have responsibilities here. Those responsibilities are heightened over the next 40-plus days. So I hope you'll take that charge out into the communities that you are in. To do that, because we really all need to do our part in this. I want to thank the Miller Center and the Karsh Institute of Democracy for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion, and of course, huge thanks to Michael and Danielle and David for a really rich conversation and for their solution sets. Let's support them in continuing to find solutions to these challenges. Thank you all.